Hi there. My channel and content, along with many other fantastic creators, is now on Means TV, the world's first anti-capitalist streaming service. I'll talk a little bit more about it at the end of the video, and I even have a nice little discount for you to check out as a thank you for supporting my channel.
Hi there. Privatization sucks, but not enough people know why. How about we take a look at a few examples? First, what exactly is privatization? Put simply, it's when a publicly owned industry or service is transferred to the private sector. Usually this means the state selling its assets off to one or multiple private companies. Privatization happens for one simple reason: profit. This is the material reason it happens, and the main reason aside from the usual propaganda we hear. Usually privatization extracts value in two ways. Firstly, the privatization period involves extremely expensive and valuable resources or infrastructure being sold off for far less than they're worth. For most things, it was your taxes that paid to build and maintain these public services or industries, but after privatization, private interests get to keep them. Secondly, during the running of the service or industry, capitalists will slowly monopolize the sector, jack up prices while paying the people who actually keep it running as low as they can get away with. Besides clear material reasons, meaning profit, there are ideological reasons too. These are the usual arguments that are made as to why privatization should take place. Two popular criticisms of nationalized services are sometimes referred to as the free rider and forced rider problems. You've probably heard some variation on these arguments before. Neoliberals often argue that nationalization is bad because people can use a service without paying for it, or because somebody could be forced to pay for a service which they did not use. Privatization solves both of these issues, they claim, by measuring usage on an individual level, denying access to those who do not pay, and allowing people the option to quote-unquote not pay and not receive the service. These ideas both fail to account for the complexity of economies, instead simplifying things down to a single point of purchase. You don't have to directly use a service to benefit from it existing. There can be secondary effects. People taking the train reduce overall traffic and congestion, which benefits you as someone who might never use the train and solely travel by car, for example. Many industries have economy-wide benefits which make it inevitable that everyone in the economy will benefit from them eventually. This is just a reality of modern complex economies. Privatization is a distinctly neoliberal concept because it relies so heavily on this fantastical understanding of individuality. It's capitalism not as a means to an end, but as a principle. The more common argument is that privatization increases efficiency. These are far more variable and specific to the industry and location, of course, and they would usually frame this in the way that it would lower costs or improve quality or promote innovation or anything else. How it actually improves efficiency can change depending on the person making the argument. Generally though, they will say that this is because of competition. In reality, privatization is almost always less efficient than public ownership. This is because public services can be inefficient by mistake or mismanagement, but privatization is inefficient by design. The most important and obvious issue is profit. Shareholders demand a profit. This is money directly drained from the system, paid for by people, but not reinvested, that instead goes into enriching the already rich. Privatization requires splitting a single industry into multiple separate parts in order to create the illusion of competition. This diminishes the economies of scale component, making things slower or more expensive. This separation also hinders cooperation between people in the industry, where instead of having combined development, you'll have two or more competing firms working on the exact same thing at the exact same time. More to the point though, the mythology of competition further falls apart when you realize that companies are far more likely to find one specific area to monopolize than to actually compete on an industry-wide scale. This is often done by just monopolizing different regions in a particular country each, or different segments of the industry. This is not even mentioning the centralization of capital, which is the tendency for net competitors to reduce as more winners emerge in any meaningful competition, resulting in oligopolies and monopolies in critical sectors. Taking this to its logical conclusion, you end up with one or two private megacorps hoping to extract every last penny of profit from a service or industry, instead of having it run as a public good. The profit motive is not the same as the social good, and often encourages companies to act directly against that aim. The US is ripe with examples. They are overly risky because they're so confident in government bailouts if things go wrong. They focus far more on richer communities than poorer ones. They are insistent on paying out absurdly oversized salaries for pointless managerial positions, the list goes on. My point being, however inefficient you think a public industry is, privatization will do nothing to address those issues. Instead, it will bring a whole host of its own inefficiencies. How about we take a look at a few examples? After the turn of the 1980s, neoliberalism and the reduction of the state had become the dominant philosophy of the British government, and many industries were targeted with privatization. In continuation of this trend, throughout the 90s, the National Rail Service in Britain was also privatized, despite some reservations within the government. The approach taken was both radical and disjointed. Rather than privatizing British Rail as a single entity or breaking it into a few larger regional businesses, the government chose to split the network into dozens of separate companies, each responsible for different aspects of rail operations. This included Railtrack, which took over the ownership of tracks, signals, and stations; train operating companies, which ran passenger services under government-awarded franchises; rolling stock companies, which owned and leased out the actual trains; and numerous subcontractors responsible for maintenance and infrastructure work. The reason for this incredibly stupid and inefficient scheme was to prevent any one trade union growing too big or influential. From the beginning, Railtrack was structured as a private, profit-making entity, despite being entirely dependent on public subsidies. The company's focus on shareholder returns led to widespread cost-cutting, safety lapses, and a general neglect of long-term investment. Railtrack's operational incompetence became clear almost immediately. Its first attempt at publishing a railway timetable in 1995 had so many errors it had to be reissued. At the same time, other aspects of the privatization process showed just how hasty and ill-considered the reforms were. Rolling stock companies were sold off cheaply, often to financial institutions that quickly resold them for profits. Investors and banks, rather than passengers or taxpayers, emerged as the primary beneficiaries of privatization, while the government continued to pour billions into propping up the system at a loss to themselves. Today, the structure of Britain's rail industry is a hybrid mix of public and private elements, marked by inefficiency and complexity. Of course, it's Britain. Network Rail, which replaced the collapsed private rail track in 2002, was reclassified as a government body in 2014, effectively renationalizing some parts of rail infrastructure. However, the rest of the industry remains heavily privatized. Train operators pay to lease the physical trains from rolling stock companies. 3 companies dominate this industry and make substantial profits. Despite this, private train operators rely on government subsidies to be viable, but still, of course, take out dividends for shareholders. Railtrack's mismanagement was a contributing factor in multiple major railway disasters, including the Ladbroke Grove crash, with 31 people killed and 417 injured, and the Hatfield crash, killing 4 people and injuring more than 70. These crashes exposed deep flaws in the system's safety overnight. Investigations into these incidents showed that cost-cutting and outsourcing had led to critical maintenance failures, which further eroded public trust in the private rail industry. Significant adjustments had to be made after that, including replacing Railtrack with National Rail to ensure a safer operation. The industry has still struggled with inefficiencies, delays, and inconsistent service quality ever since. Despite promises that privatization would foster competition and reduce costs, government subsidies to the rail industry now far exceed the highest levels British Rail ever received. Fare regulation is another key element of the system, with around 45% of ticket prices subject to government-imposed caps. However, unregulated fares, particularly peak and long-distance tickets, have risen sharply, leading to one of the most expensive railway systems in Europe. One of the central justifications for privatization was a belief that it would reduce the financial burden of the railways on taxpayers. In reality, the opposite has occurred. The cost of running Britain's railway has soared, with much of the public subsidies being funneled into private profits rather than being reinvested in infrastructure or service improvements. Since privatization, private train operators and rolling stock companies have extracted at least £8.3 billion in dividend payments. Let's analyze this a bit. On the nonsense point of competition, the system doesn't deliver competition. Most of the time, you have no choice at all about which operator you travel with. For shorter trips or less popular routes, you're just stuck with whoever holds the contract for that particular journey. You may have some options if you're heading from one major hub to another and have the luxury of flexible timing, but even that is still minimal. Operators manipulate prices based on demand, meaning if you need to travel at peak commute times, you'll be price gouged for profits. Unless you're going to move to another part of the country, you're stuck with your local operator. Train companies can only lease physical trains from one of 3 private companies, who face no competition and act only as middlemen. There's still only one set of rails, so the infrastructure and management, the majority of actual substance, is still done by one dedicated body, directly subordinate to and funded by the government. You'd barely notice it was privatized if it wasn't so unaffordable. Most trains that run in the UK contain a first-class section. This is usually almost identical to the rest of the train. Sometimes it's literally exactly the same with a sign on the wall. Nonetheless, prices are often double or more than that of the usual fare. This happens because train companies cannot increase their overall prices by more than a certain amount each year, but the regulation doesn't apply to first class. These seats rarely sell, for obvious reasons, so even busy trains have a little empty section that nobody is allowed to sit in. The private sector actively creates this inefficiency because private business prioritizes exploitation over efficiency. If it can make more money inefficiently, it will. The rich will pay more to avoid sitting next to normal people, but you can't pay less if you end up standing the whole day, so the seats stay empty. A similar issue of corporate waste is enforcement. The company responsible for London's public transport network managed to spend £20 million more on enforcement than it collected in fines. All the money spent on ticket machines, automatic barriers, ticket inspectors on trains and platforms, and prosecuting fare evasion is all money spent that could be spent on improving the service, that instead goes to protecting profit margins. This is the outcome of a system designed by people who think getting something for free is a problem. The privatization of Britain's railway has been an expensive failure. Despite decades of fare increases, government subsidies, and restructuring efforts, the system remains inefficient, fragmented, and reliant on state intervention. None of the promised benefits came. Instead, an overly expensive system allows rail companies to rake in profits.
We invest. Can I get some water? Thank you. I really did need a glass of water. This is not a stunt. Now, I'm going to talk about this. Everybody settle down. This is a feisty crowd.
In the US, access to clean and affordable water is far from guaranteed. Testing across the country uncovered unsafe levels of lead, forever plastics, and arsenic in drinking water. Today, more than 2 million Americans lack access to clean drinking water at home. There's also a severe regional disparity. In Puerto Rico, nearly all of the population drinks from unsafe water sources. Currently, around 15% of US water customers rely on private suppliers. The trend towards privatization really began in the 1980s under the Reagan administration, after which private water has been growing since. Mainly this is through public-private partnerships, where the state retained ownership of infrastructure but handed the management over to private companies. The first and most immediate impact of water privatization is price hikes. On average, private suppliers charge between $144 and $185 more per year than public ones. That's an average of 59% increase for the same service. In some states, the cost difference is even more extreme. In Pennsylvania, for example, it's $323. The research is clear. Private ownership is the single largest factor in increasing water bills. It increases water bills by a larger margin than even severe drought, if you can believe it. Even when there's no difference in the way the system is managed, costs increase magically. In some cases, municipalities aren't even given details on the spending. They're simply sent a bill without any financial oversight. The problem isn't just cost, it's also quality. Privatization has led to systemic failures across the country. One of the most infamous cases happened in Atlanta, which signed a 20-year contract with United Water in 1998. The results were so bad that the city was forced to terminate the contract just 4 years later. Water had to be boiled due to low pressure. Residents reported brown, rust-colored water coming out of their taps. Entire neighborhoods went without water for extended periods because of a backlog of maintenance requests. Instead of improving service, privatization led to neglect, underinvestment, and widespread customer complaints. The only notable improvement over the public sector was in their enforcement of unpaid bills, of course. Again, this system provides no meaningful competition between companies. There's absolutely no consumer choice. You pay whoever manages your water supply or you don't get water. The only competition that does occur once every few years is between whichever companies are big enough to bid on a contract. Comparable countries that have a publicly owned, nationally led water supply perform much better overall and are able to provide efficient, high-quality water to their entire population, unlike the US. I shouldn't need to remind you that the US is the wealthiest country on Earth. You guys are getting taken for a ride. Bolivia's experience with neoliberal reforms began in 1985, when the country became a testing ground for structural adjustment policies aimed at ending hyperinflation. While inflation was curbed, the wider economic consequences were devastating. Privatization gutted public resources, inequality soared, and unemployment worsened. Under pressure from international lenders, Bolivia was forced to open its economy to foreign investment, leading to the piecemeal sell-off of its considerable natural resource wealth. The state oil company, YPFB, was broken apart and sold off under the 1996 hydrocarbon law. Foreign corporations, including Enron and Shell, gained control over Bolivia's energy sector, without even purchasing their stakes outright. Instead, they committed to investing an equivalent amount over 7 years, effectively gaining control for free. The impacts were immediate. Revenue from hydrocarbons, once a key pillar of Bolivia's economy, were drained away as foreign companies took 82% of profits, while the Bolivian state retained just 18%. Local governments saw their funding slashed and congressional oversight was stripped away, allowing deals to be made in secrecy. Corruption flourished, as former officials found comfortable jobs in the same foreign companies they had helped bring into the country. At the same time, the Bolivian people saw little benefit. Despite new gas discoveries, public services deteriorated as state revenues dwindled. Frustration grew, culminating in mass uprisings like the 2000 water war and the 2003 gas war. These protests were met with brutal repression, with dozens of demonstrators killed in what became known as Black October. The violence forced President Sanchez de Lozada to flee the country, but by then the damage had already been done. Bolivia's natural wealth had been siphoned away for years, and its people were left with the consequences. By 2006, Evo Morales was elected on a wave of popular discontent, pledging to reclaim the country's resources. A 2004 referendum had already made it clear over 90% of voters supported nationalization. On May 1, 2006, Morales issued a decree returning the gas sector to state control. Foreign companies were given an ultimatum: renegotiate contracts on Bolivia's terms or leave. Unlike the chaotic privatization process, nationalization was a structured and strategic effort. Morales' government leveraged Bolivia's position as a key energy supplier to Brazil and Argentina, renegotiating supply contracts at a higher price. Control over production was restored, with a larger share of revenues flowing into public coffers rather than corporate bank accounts. This effort was extremely successful. Between 2005 and 2006, Bolivia's non-financial public sector went from running a deficit to achieving a surplus of 4.5% of GDP. Revenues from the hydrocarbon sector increased nearly sevenfold in nominal terms. This financial turnaround allowed the government to expand social spending, boosting funding for healthcare, education, pensions, and poverty alleviation programs. Over 11% of hydrocarbon revenues were earmarked for universities, indigenous groups, and direct cash transfers to low-income seniors through the Renta Dignidad program. Public spending on essential services rose by 45% in real terms between 2005 and 2012. While the economy grew rapidly, poverty rates also fell quite significantly, with about 1 million Bolivians lifted out of poverty during this period. Crucially, nationalization also allowed Bolivia to take a more active role in shaping its own energy future. Investment continued under new terms that prioritized local development. The government mandated technology transfer agreements and local content commitments, ensuring that foreign investment served Bolivian interests rather than the other way around. In 2013, Morales inaugurated Bolivia's first natural gas liquid separation plant, increasing the value added from gas production and keeping more wealth within the country. Morales' administration even provided investors with something rare in Bolivia's history: social stability and legitimacy. The United States and the private interests they serve hated that, however, and they sponsored an illegal coup to overthrow the democratically elected government of Bolivia shortly thereafter. But that's a story for another time. Some industries are known as natural monopolies, and this phrase often comes up in discussion around nationalization and privatization. This is a free market term used to refer to industries which even they accept will naturally and inevitably lead to monopoly. Sometimes this is because of the extremely high cost of starting a new business in the industry, or because it's reliant on a single set infrastructure. Things such as rail, energy, and so on. Most of the debate around privatization centers on these industries. The problem is, this is a misleading and largely useless framing. In reality, a capitalist economy will always tend towards monopoly. It is a fundamental product of the system and the goal of all capitalists. Despite constant patchwork attempts by regulatory bodies, we can see this outcome coming. Look at media production, big tech, or social media companies, or countless other examples. Competition creates winners, and winners take the loser's market share. Capital therefore constantly accumulates. Refer to my video here if you're interested. The failures of privatization, and there are many, are not unique to some industries. They may be more apparent or happen faster, sure, but they're really just the wider inevitable failures of this privatization mythology. A mythology they don't even believe in, but push for the sake of profit-seeking at the expense of all the rest of the population. Nationalization of critical infrastructure and services isn't sometimes the solution. It is always the solution. A better world is possible.
Back to our exciting announcement. You can now find my content on Means TV. If you're not familiar with Means TV, they're an explicitly anti-capitalist worker-owned cooperative that produces worker-owned educational and entertainment content in a streaming service format. You can find everything from my videos to original series like Means Morning News to feature-length documentaries like Abby Martin's Gaza Fights for Freedom, with more amazing content being added every day. As you all know, leftist creators have to be incredibly careful to avoid the various forms of censorship that, for some reason, don't affect the right. I wonder why. Regardless, my uncensored videos and more edgy content can comfortably be viewed on Means TV without all the tricks and clever self-censorship needed. A platform that allows us to say what we want to say and make what we really want to make. We can even chat and discuss on a community forum where creators can engage with each other and their viewers right on the platform. The main reason I and many others joined, however, is that Means TV is ideologically dedicated to supporting principled socialist content. As a little thank you for watching my channel, if you sign up with my link below, you can get your first month 20% off. That's only $7.99 a month. Or for an even better deal, you can opt for the annual plan and get 20% off the whole year. Every person who signs up using my link is directly contributing to the financial stability of my channel and the entire cooperative media project. Had it not been for you guys and your support, my channel, the Deprogram, and Means TV wouldn't be possible. So if you'd like to help support my work and that of many other fantastic creators, consider signing up for Means TV using my link below.
That's all for this time. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you to Nitro Dubs, Kenny, Thomas Roberts, Nicholas, Owen Baker, T. Wood, Dr. Lemonman, Lumix, Charlie and Eric, Ultimate Turin, Daniel Ethel, The Generic Guy, Santiago Pereira, Rain, Cassandra Corvus, David Fries, Confuse M, Mariana Mastusovic, Robbie Richardson, and Masay Kadro. Thanks for watching. Currently, around 15% of US water customers rely on private suppliers. Do you hear that? Somebody's fucking sawing wood. I've never heard anybody saw wood in my life in this fucking apartment. Have they stopped? Jesus. Okay, I'm just gonna pause the recording.